Hey, it's Grayson Hawk here on Planet Peterson. Now, on my channel, I typically focus on science, history, and debating against pseudoscience. I don't typically try to make the positive argument for atheism, although I do consider myself to be an atheist. Back on planet Earth, more than 50% of humanity believes in the existence of the Abrahamic God, the God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Although, full disclaimer, everybody kind of has their own unique conception of God, so everyone's kind of praying to their own sky daddy. But generally speaking, all of these 4.3 billion people are considered to be worshiping the same monotheistic God. So how did that come about? Now, there's a ton of evidence against God's existence already, from the problem of evil to divine hiddenness, but in my opinion, the best argument against the existence of God is human history. Our ancestors did not always have the concept of God. That too, like us, had to evolve over time. So to begin to trace the arc of God's evolution over the course of human history, we're going to have to go back before human history, to our pre-human ancestors. Specifically, we have to talk about a cognitive bias that is evolutionarily favorable and selected for, called hypersensitive agent detection. I know, scientists are not good at coming up with the flashiest of names. It sounds pretty dry, but it is of crucial importance. I mean, we are talking about the literal birth of God here, people. So in short, agent detection is just the inclination of animals like us humans to presume the purposeful intervention of a sentient, intelligent agent in situations that may or may not warrant it. So to give an example, right? Think of you being one of our ancient pre-human ape-like ancestors, right? You're in the woods, it's nighttime, and you hear a twig snap somewhere out there in the darkness. Now, somebody who has a hypersensitive agent detection bias in their cognition, right? They'll immediately think that that is somebody out there. That's a predator, that's a stranger, that is an agent out there in the darkness, and their first interaction is to run, right? Well, somebody that is maybe not so sensitive in agent detection maybe might not attribute that to another entity at all. The cons as of a false positive, you don't really lose anything other than you got scared and ran away, and then you come back and realize that nothing happened. But if you have an underdeveloped agent detection, right? If you gamble and lost, you get eaten. So having a more hypersensitive agent detection scheme in your brain is going to be evolutionarily favored because it's better safe than sorry, ultimately. It's the more conservative survival strategy. It is evolutionarily favorable for us to have a higher false alarm rate for agent detection than not. And that's why us humans naturally have a very hypersensitive agent detection schema. I mean, you can see this in kids, right? If you give them a sippy cup, they'll give it a name and start talking to it like it's a person, right? They do this with random objects. They'll do it with the sun. They'll do it with a bird. Any old thing, they'll start attributing agency to it. And children are emblematic of humans' predisposition towards this hypersensitive agency detection. Now, when humans begin to develop socially and come together in social kin groups, and Homo sapiens develop and we become hunter-gatherers in small social bands, it becomes advantageous for us to have a shared story, a shared identity. And to that end, cultural knowledge begins to grow generationally as it's passed on from one to the other. So this sort of hypersensitive agent detection begins to snowball until you have something like animism. Now, animism is the most basal state of human religion. That is the state that us humans existed in for well over 90% of human history. For this video specifically, I will be relying heavily on Hunter-Gatherers and the Origin of Religion by Hervey C. Peoples, Pavel Duda, and Frank Marlowe. Now, animism is not considered to be a true religion with gods, right? Animism is basically the furthest extent of hypersensitive agent detection that you could imagine. Every single stream, every tree, every river, every mountain, every animal, everything has a spirit. Now, it's not a moralizing religion. These spirits do not try to control human morality. The spirits are not going to be watching you to make sure that you're a good person. The spirits are mostly going to be doing their own things and have their own concerns, unless you disrespect them, and then you will be punished. I like to think of animism as almost like the baby polytheism, right? You have a near countless infinite number of individual spirits inhabiting every aspect of the world in animism. And that's the start of human religious thought, right? You can see very naturally how this leads out of our natural cognitive tendencies towards agent detection. Now, the arc that we're going to be following towards the development of God is going to see us go from more and more weaker gods and spirits towards increasingly fewer, more and more powerful gods until we get to just one at the end. That's the overall arc. But like I said, we're starting out with a bunch of baby god spirits in animism. So what's next? Well, most basal animistic beliefs don't even have the concept of an afterlife. You simply die and that's the end of your life. The innovation of the afterlife and a specific spiritual gatekeeper known as a shaman leads us to our next stage of religion after animism: shamanism. As soon as people came up with this idea that there was an afterlife, that you had to fulfill certain spiritual steps in order to get to, you can have spiritual gatekeepers who are either holding some type of knowledge or some sort of rite that only they can perform that will allow you to get into the afterlife. This allows for the establishment of a religious elite. For many small-scale tribes, this might just be an individual person, a shaman or a witch doctor. But for larger and larger societies, this becomes more and more of a class of people, a religious elite of gatekeepers who keep the sacred knowledge or perform the sacred traditions that stand between the general populace and the afterlife or other types of spiritual rewards, such as divine intervention from the spirits or whatever. You have to be on their good side if you want spiritual benefits, essentially. Now, as human civilization begins to develop, the invention of settled agriculture and the birth of cities, we begin to transition towards not just spirits, but outright gods. It is incredibly difficult to pinpoint when this transition was made and who were the oldest, most ancient known gods worshipped by humans. For example, there are tens of thousands of years of Neolithic Venus figurines, which some people say are goddess statues, while others say it's nothing more than a household erotic stimulant. There's also the cult of the skull that we see in Jericho and the Levant area. But without the advent of written language, it is extremely difficult to interpret which figures in ancient archaeology are gods, which might be mythic heroes, which might be true kings or queens. It's incredibly hard to decipher if we don't have a text. So the earliest gods that we have attestations to in the written record are in Mesopotamia and Egypt. And these are going to be two huge spheres of influence that feed into the creation of the God we know today. Remember how in animism, every single mountain and stream and valley had its own spirit associated with it? Well, at this point, humans have begun building cities at such a large scale that these cities now need their own gods to rule over it. These gods physically resided in the temple in the heart of these cities. So the very first city that we have written attestations for in human history is the city of Eridu in Mesopotamia. The god of Eridu was Enki, and he physically lived in the temple in the heart of the city. But other rival cities sprang up all over southern Mesopotamia, including one, Uruk, which would eclipse them all and grow to be the largest city of that region in that era. And the god in Inanna temple in Uruk was actually a goddess, Inanna, the goddess of love and beauty and warfare. Inanna lived there. She was bathed every day by her attendants. She was fed. She received wine. She liked the smell of incense. She was continually offered gifts. She was treated as if she was a real living thing in the middle of the temple. And in fact, the entire government of the city was intertwined with the temple as well, and Inanna was the head of the government. That's right, the invention of government in the very first city in the world was literally a church equals state government. The head of the government was the head priest of Inanna, but it was likely viewed by the populace that Inanna was the real one in charge. And I mean, if you have the kind of conception where you believe that these gods are real, it's hard to think of a better argument about who you would rather pay your taxes to better than a god, right? Like, I mean, if you have to pay taxes to somebody, would you rather pay it to a human institution, or would you rather give your taxes directly to Inanna? I mean, who's more likely to know better what to do with your money, right? So essentially, in the written record, the very earliest point in time where we start to see gods is the first time that we're also seeing things like government, state, taxes, bureaucracy, all of that. They are interconnected and intertwined in this initial birthing stage. And Inanna was already incredibly powerful. I mean, she is the goddess of love, sex, and fertility, but also of just war and killing and bloodshed. I mean, she's always seen with these epic assortments of armor and weapons. We also get a lot of influence from her in the Bible, for example, like Eve eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Well, Inanna, initially in the stories, the mythologies, she didn't know about all of this sexual knowledge, and she had to go and search of a fruit of a tree of knowledge to which she ate, and that's how she became a goddess of sex and learned all of her sexual know-how. So we can see this directly reflected in the Bible stories. So Inanna was the top dog in Uruk for like almost 1,000 years, you know, from 4000 BC almost to 3000 BC. But over time, you have the rise of kingship, this initial structure of power with the temple and the church equals the state would give way to the rise of the Lugal, the first secular kings. And I only say that they were secular in that they were also not the head of the temple like before. And with the rise of kingship in Mesopotamia, we also see the rise of kingship amongst the gods. No longer would Inanna reign supreme. We would then see, almost exclusively for the rest of human history after this point, the heads of pantheons were the kings of the gods. Now that humans have kings, now our gods would have kings as well. Think of Zeus or Odin or Marduk or El in Canaan. And Canaan is really the centerpiece for the rest of this story, because Canaan is where the God of Abraham will emerge out of in the Iron Age. Canaan is an area of land roughly between Egypt and Turkey in the Levant, with an extremely long, deep, and rich history, stretching all the way back before recorded times and deeply into this milieu that we have been discussing, where each city has its own god. This is the kind of religious background of polytheism that we see in the Canaan region all throughout the early Bronze Age, especially reaching zeniths with things like the Ebla Kingdom, a powerful Canaanite kingdom in the north in the early Bronze Age. However, by the late Bronze Age, other powers had grown to eclipse the kingdoms of Canaan. You had the Hittites in Anatolia to the north, the Mitanni, Assyrians, and Babylonians to the east, and the Egyptians to the south. So during the late Bronze Age, the region of Canaan was largely under the influence of these far greater powers. And we see this influence in its religious development. For example, Mesopotamian mythological elements become added into the Bible, such as the flood of Noah, which was originally the flood of Atrahasis in Akkadian. Or we have the Tower of Babel, which was adopted from an ancient Sumerian myth about how their own language changed over time as their empire expanded too far afield. Those of you who may be fans of history know what's coming next. Boom come the Sea People and collapse the entire Bronze Age Mediterranean world. The Hittites collapse and the Egyptians are barely holding on to their own borders. So the Canaanite people are freshly free. So let's check in with what their Canaanite religion was like at the time of the late Bronze Age collapse. The Canaanites, like we said, were polytheistic with a head male god at the top of this pantheon. This was El, E-L, which is basically just the Canaanite word for God. There's El and the plural is Elohim, which you might recognize. Now, if you've ever been curious about why today God is often depicted as an old bearded guy with a robe, that's the Canaanite god El. That is how El was depicted, as the head of the Canaanite pantheon was an old bearded man. This is the god that would eventually form the base for the God of Abraham today. In Canaanite text recovered in Ugarit, it actually says that the god El does not reside within the cities of Canaan. That El himself actually, again, the head of the Canaanite pantheon, resides at the source of the two rivers in a very lush area. What does that sound like? And keep in mind that the Sumerian word for a lush area of land is Eden, or in Akkadian, Adinu. Didn't you ever wonder why it was called the Garden of Eden? Like, who's Eden? Why is it their garden? It is a loan word from Sumeria that harkens back to the description of where El lived in the Canaanite religion. It's not a coincidence that Eden is literally described as being at the source of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the two most prominent rivers in ancient Mesopotamia. So to proceed further and talk about the development of Hebrew culture, we have to talk about oppositional identity cultural development. And this is when your own culture begins to develop in opposition with your neighbors. The group of Canaanites that interest us the most in particular is a collection of kins groups of herdsmen in the Central Hills area of Israel, fairly rural and isolated compared to the more metropolitan regions and larger cities. This group of Canaanite herdsmen develop into the Proto-Israelites. Initially, they are worshiping the same Canaanite pantheon as the other surrounding regions. However, from our very earliest clues, it seems that this particular group placed a special emphasis on the head of the pantheon, El. Now, these early Proto-Hebrews began to start putting more and more emphasis on specifically El, right? They don't want to worship Baal, they don't want to worship Yam, they want to worship El and his wife Asherah. So most of their earliest temples, we see a place for God, El, and his wife Asherah. We still see the remnants of this worship of God's wife in the Bible, where it refers to the stick of Asherah, which is an instrument associated with this goddess. Now, before we go any further in talking about the development of the Hebrews, it has to be emphasized that there's not necessarily just one group of people right now that would become the Hebrews. It is thought by a lot of Bible scholars that actually there are two different origins of the Jewish people in the Old Testament. One through the route of Abraham and one through the route of Moses, and that these were two different origin stories that were then combined when these people had some sort of alliance. In the beginning it was El, and then eventually it would become a god called Yahweh. Now, nobody knows exactly if Yahweh was a natural development out of the Canaanite pantheon with El, or Yahweh could have been introduced from a foreign source. For example, two Egyptian texts actually from the Bronze Age mention a people known as the Shasu of Yahweh. Now, this is strange because Yahweh here is used as a location of or a geographical feature rather than a god, but it is the hieroglyphic equivalent of the Tetragrammaton Yahweh. And these Shasu people seem to be active in the southern Levant and Sinai Peninsula. So this is highly speculative, but it is at least possible that the God of Yahweh could have been introduced to the Proto-Hebrews from these Shasu people from the Sinai Peninsula. And who do we know that came up from the Sinai Peninsula Moses. And who do we know in the Bible introduced the concept of Yahweh? Moses. In Exodus 6:3, for example, God tells Moses that he appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but the name Yahweh was not known to them. This seems to belie some sort of syncretism wherein the Yahweh God of Moses and his refugee followers was syncretized with the El God of these more indigenous homegrown Canaanites. By the way, this Iron Age phenomenon of Yahweh worship does have an official name. The religion is Yahwism. So there's also oppositional identities arising just in between the different Israel tribes. So you have the tribal confederacy of Israel in the north, 10 tribes of Israel, and then in the south you had the kingdom of Judah. And it seems there was a divide between north and south at this point, with the south being more conservative and trying to define themselves in opposition to the north that was maybe more predisposed to worshiping these other gods like Baal whenever they saw convenient. And the southern kingdom of Judah in this point in time would be developing in opposition to those more liberal practices in the north, and would be moving more and more in the direction of monolatry and eventually monotheism. And of course, needless to say, they got rid of God's wife a while back. Then, just like the Sea People hundreds of years earlier, the Assyrians this time sweep into northern Israel and decimate the northern confederacy and just disperse all of those tribes and wipe them out to the rest of human history. Those are the 10 lost tribes of Israel. But there were political intrigues, unrest, and civil war threats back home in Assyria, and the king stopped the conquest and turned around and spared the southern kingdom of Judah, who saw this as, of course, a miracle from their God. Now, this is probably one of my most favorite historical what-ifs, right? What if the Assyrian king had just kept going and crushed Judea and dispersed all of the Israel tribes? Then would we even have monotheism today? If there was no Judaism, there'd be no Christianity and then no Islam. So if the Assyrians had finished their conquest, what would the world that we live in today look like? The repercussions of just this one event in history are so unfathomably immense, you can't even contemplate it. So anyway, even though they were spared by the Assyrians, they really weren't long for this world anyway, and like 100 years later, a different power, the Babylonians, would come, and they would be the ones to finish the job and conquer Judea. But the Jews were lucky in that regard because the Babylonians were way more chill than the Assyrians. And rather than just having a policy of ethnic genocides, the Babylonians took the Jews to Babylon for a period of about 100 years. And this is known as the Babylonian captivity. And this is the last big influence on the development of the Abrahamic God today that I want to touch on: the Zoroastrian influence. So at the time of the Babylonian captivity, Zoroastrianism was all the rage in Babylon. Zoroastrianism is sometimes called a dual monotheistic religion because Zoroaster is kinda the guy who introduced the concept of good versus evil, light versus darkness, that whole kind of thing. Before this, it wasn't this kind of struggle. There was a harmonious balance in most cultures that had these kind of dualistic concepts. But Zoroaster thought differently, right? This was good versus evil, and good had to win in the end and triumph over evil. It's not about balance, it's about getting rid of the other guy. And so in Zoroastrianism, you have one big, all-good God, right? He is light, he is goodness, and he has a retinue of angelic beings and a hierarchy in heaven. And then you have his counterpart, the great evil, and he has his own hierarchy to oppose the angels. And so, of course, what does this sound like? This period of Babylonian captivity was monumental in the evolution of God. Remember how we said earlier stages God actually physically resided in the temple? Well, with the destruction of the temple, they had to adapt their ideas about what God is during this 100 years of captivity, where they could no longer give God food and wine and things in his temple. So your concept of God has to change accordingly. And God became omnipresent, basically, because his home was physically destroyed by the Babylonians. After 100 years in Babylonian exile, the Jews are returned to their homeland by one of the coolest guys in all of history, Cyrus the Great. And when they get back to Israel after that period of time in Babylon, all of a sudden we've got angels and demons, and eventually you got Satan and hell, and it's basically the picture has formed. And during the Second Temple period that would follow, this is the period of time where we see the birth of Jesus Christ, Christianity, eventually to lead to Islam, and there are a ton of different groups that fragment. I mean, if you're looking at a phylogenetic tree of religion, it's like even more complicated than an evolutionary phylogenetic tree, because in addition to these groups continuously branching out and forming different religious sects all the time, there's also the fact that they can receive influences from multiple different areas, right? In the development of God here, we talked about how he's getting Canaanite background in with this Mesopotamian influence, in with Egyptian influence, and finally with that Zoroastrianism little layering on top, right? There's all kinds of diverse influences that feed into the evolution of these concepts. But we started out with a bunch of really weak, infinite number of little spirits, and they get fewer and fewer and stronger until you have a polytheistic pantheon of gods of certain aspects, which then keep getting combined in this kind of game of cosmic crabs in a barrel, right? And only the strongest god wins and comes out on top. So they keep adding more and more powers to the god of their choice. I genuinely don't understand how someone can know about the history and development of our species, and specifically our religious history of development and the course of change that our understanding of gods and God have gone through over history. I don't know how anyone can understand that and still believe that it's real. Like, you really think that there were just billions of years of development and millions of years of vertebrate evolution, all the way up to the cultural sophistication of human societies, to the point where we can finally develop some sort of notion of gods, and you think that they got it right. The whole time that we were developing, we had no idea, we were just fish. And now, a bunch of people in the Bronze Age, they're the ones that figured it out. I mean, come on, just use your brain, think rationally. How can you understand the arc of human history and still believe in this shit? Anyways, if you're the type of person that actually does have a thinking brain capable of critical reasoning, then what are you doing? Subscribe to Planet Peterson and Grayson Hawk and hit that bell. Stay tuned for future videos. And hopefully in the future we can go from infinite to many to 1 to 0 gods.